My name is Keisha, and I am 34 years old. I will never forget the sound of my expensive leather suitcase hitting the manicured grass of our Atlanta front lawn. Right after the divorce, I flew to a new city with my daughter. Meanwhile, my ex-husband and his entire family were excitedly waiting for his mistress to get her ultrasound results. But the moment the doctor spoke, no one could say a word. The silence in that clinic was not just shock. It was the sound of a carefully crafted and arrogant family legacy shattering into a million pieces. They thought they had broken me, but they had only handed me the matches to burn their facade to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who underestimated your worth. The afternoon sun in Atlanta was brutally hot the day Terrence decided to finalize my humiliation. He stood on the front walkway of the 5-bedroom house I had helped furnish, wearing a tailored suit he could barely afford. With a smug grin plastered across his face, he grabbed my final piece of luggage and tossed it carelessly onto the grass. The heavy thud echoed down the quiet suburban street. Standing right beside him, clinging to his arm like a cheap accessory, was Brianna. She was 24 years old, a self-proclaimed social media model with a penchant for designer knockoffs. She was intentionally pushing out her perfectly flat stomach, rubbing it gently as if she were carrying the savior of the world. Up on the wraparound porch stood my former mother-in-law, Dolores. She was dressed in her Sunday best, complete with a wide-brimmed church hat, looking down at me with absolute contempt. She raised her hands toward the sky and shouted for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Thank you, Jesus, for finally bringing a real woman into this house. Thank you, Lord, for blessing my son with a woman who can give him a male heir to carry on the Vance family name." Her voice dripped with poison, intentionally meant to punish me for only giving her a granddaughter. She actually had the nerve to look at me and tell me to go find a cheap motel to stay in. Off to the side, my sister-in-law Tasha was circling us like a buzzard. She had her smartphone out recording the entire scene for her followers. She wanted the world to see the great Keisha Vance being thrown out into the street. She wanted to capture my tears. She wanted to capture my begging. But I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg for my marriage or my home. I simply reached down, grabbed the handle of my suitcase, and took the hand of my 10-year-old daughter, Aaliyah. She was watching her father with wide and confused eyes, but she stayed perfectly quiet and strong, just like I had taught her. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb exactly on time. The driver stepped out immediately, sensing the tension, and quickly loaded my bags into the trunk. I opened the back door for Aaliyah, helped her inside, and climbed in right behind her. As the tinted window rolled up, cutting off the sight of Terrence laughing with his mistress, I let out a long and slow breath. The silence inside the vehicle was a beautiful contrast to the toxic noise of the Vance family. As the driver navigated away from the neighborhood, I pulled my tablet from my tote bag and opened my banking application. Aaliyah leaned her head against my shoulder. I stroked her hair gently while staring at the screen. The numbers staring back at me were not the empty zeros Terrence assumed I was crying over. Instead, I was looking at a fully funded massive safety net. For the past year, while Terrence was busy sneaking around with Brianna and funneling our household money into expensive dinners and hotel rooms, I was silently enduring the death of my marriage to execute a very careful plan. My grandfather had left me a substantial trust fund when I was a teenager. It was a secret I had guarded fiercely, knowing exactly how Terrence and his greedy family would react if they ever found out about it. Terrence was a bank branch manager with an ego the size of Georgia. But he was terrible with personal finances. He spent money on luxury cars and country club memberships to maintain an illusion of wealth. If he had known about my grandfather and the trust, he would have drained it to fund his narcissistic lifestyle. When the signs of his infidelity became too obvious to ignore, I did not confront him right away. Instead, I smiled through the agonizing family dinners. I endured Dolores and her constant jabs about my inability to provide a son. I ignored Tasha and her relentless jealousy. I played the role of the submissive and oblivious wife, while quietly working with a team of financial advisors and lawyers to legally liquidate the trust fund. I made absolutely sure the money was moved into completely separate accounts that were completely protected from any divorce proceedings. By the time Terrence finally demanded a divorce and told me he was evicting me to move Brianna in, my wealth was completely untouchable. I clicked away from the banking application and opened my airline itinerary. 2 first-class tickets to Chicago were confirmed and ready. I was not going to a cheap motel. I was heading to a vibrant new city where I was going to launch my high-end real estate staging business. For years, I had a natural talent for interior design and spatial aesthetics. I knew how to make a room look like $1,000,000, but Terrence had always mocked my ambitions, telling me that staging houses was just moving furniture around for bored housewives. Now, with my grandfather's money and my absolute freedom, I was going to build an empire. "Mom, are we really leaving for good?" Aaliyah asked softly. Her small voice broke the quiet hum of the luxury vehicle. "Yes, baby, we are going on a brand new adventure," I replied, keeping my voice steady and reassuring. "Your dad needs some time to figure his life out, but we are going to be just fine. We are going to a beautiful new city where it snows in the winter and where we can start fresh." "Does he not want us anymore?" she asked, looking down at her hands. My heart broke for her, but I refused to let the poison of the Vance family infect her spirit. "This has nothing to do with you, Aaliyah. You are the most precious gift in the world. Sometimes adults make choices because they are lost or confused, but you and I are a team. We are going to build a beautiful life, just the two of us." She nodded, accepting my words, and wrapped her arms around my waist. When we arrived at the airport, the bustling crowds and loud announcements felt like the perfect distraction. We made our way through the security checkpoint and walked directly to the exclusive first-class lounge. I ordered a sparkling water and let Aaliyah pick out whatever snacks she wanted from the buffet. Sitting in the plush leather chair, I finally felt the heavy chains of Atlanta falling away from my shoulders. The suffocating church politics, the fake smiles, the constant pressure to perform for a family that hated me, it was all gone. Just as the boarding announcement echoed through the lounge, my phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down at the screen. It was a text message from Terrence. He had sent a picture of a locksmith changing the deadbolts on the front door of the house. The message beneath the photo read, "Just making sure you understand that you are never stepping foot in this house again. Good luck paying for rent on a minimum wage salary. You should have appreciated what you had." I stared at the message, a slow smile spreading across my face. He was so incredibly arrogant, so completely blind to his own impending ruin. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the greatest gift of my life by letting me go. He had no idea about the massive fortune sitting in my bank account. He had no idea that his precious mistress was carrying a secret that would soon detonate his entire world. And he certainly had no idea that the house he was so proud to lock me out of was already heavily mortgaged and heading toward foreclosure because of his own reckless spending. I did not reply to his pathetic attempt at intimidation. I did not type out an angry response or try to defend myself. I simply swiped the screen, deleted the conversation thread, and pressed the button on the side of my phone to power it down completely. I slipped the dark screen into my designer tote bag, picked up my carry-on luggage, and took Aaliyah by the hand. We walked down the jet bridge and stepped onto the plane, welcomed by the smiling flight attendants who directed us to our spacious seats at the very front of the cabin. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted off the ground, ascending through the thick Atlanta clouds, I looked out the window and took a deep, cleansing breath. The Vance family thought they had left me with nothing but ashes. They did not realize that I was perfectly comfortable walking through the fire, and I was going to use those very same ashes to paint my masterpiece in Chicago. I leaned back into my seat and closed my eyes, fully prepared for the beautiful journey ahead. 2 days after my flight touched down in the freezing wind of Chicago, a very different atmosphere was boiling over back in Atlanta. Terrence had taken the entire day off from the bank. He dressed in his finest custom suit, eager to play the role of the triumphant patriarch. He strutted into the waiting room of the most exclusive obstetric clinic in Buckhead, with his chest puffed out, holding the door open for his newly installed queen. Brianna sauntered through the double doors wearing a tight designer maternity dress that she had absolutely bought using the credit cards Terrence was already struggling to pay off. She carried herself like royalty, holding her barely visible stomach as if protecting a fragile diamond. Right behind them marched my former mother-in-law Dolores and my former sister-in-law Tasha. They formed a royal guard of sheer arrogance. Dolores was practically vibrating with self-importance. She marched straight up to the mahogany reception desk and announced to the entire clinic that the Vance family heir was arriving for his first major medical checkup. She spoke loudly, making sure every single pregnant woman and waiting husband in that room knew that her son was a highly successful banking executive. She declared that this baby was a miracle child destined for absolute greatness and wealth. Tasha was right there beside her, holding her phone high in the air, recording everything for her massive online following. She panned the camera around the upscale clinic, narrating loudly about how blessed her brother was to finally have a real and fertile woman by his side. Terrence stood in the center of the waiting room, soaking up the attention like a sponge. For years, he had felt emasculated by his own secret medical issues, but now he felt like a king. He believed he had successfully discarded his useless first wife and secured his masculine legacy. The nurses exchanged tight and polite smiles, clearly annoyed by the loud disruption, but they kept their professional composure. When the nurse finally called Brianna's name, the entire Vance clan stood up in unison. They moved down the quiet hallway, like a parade, completely ignoring the clinic policy that usually limited the number of guests in the examination room. Dolores bulldozed her way past the nurse, insisting that she had to be present to witness the first heartbeat of her precious grandson. Terrence held Brianna's hand, flashing a winning smile at the staff. The examination room was dimly lit and smelled of sterile alcohol wipes and lavender air freshener. Brianna climbed onto the examination table and adjusted her dress while the doctor walked in. Dr. Evans was a seasoned professional with decades of experience and a calm, reassuring demeanor. He shook Terrence's hand, congratulated the couple, and booted up the state-of-the-art ultrasound machine. Dolores stood right beside the monitor, clasping her hands together in dramatic prayer. Tasha angled her phone to get the perfect shot for her social media story, ready to broadcast this glorious moment to the world. Dr. Evans dimmed the lights further and applied the clear gel to Brianna's stomach. The cold gel made her shiver slightly, and Terrence leaned in to kiss her forehead, playing the role of the perfectly devoted father. The ultrasound wand glided across her skin, and suddenly the rhythmic and rapid thumping of a tiny heartbeat filled the small room. The sound echoed off the walls. Dolores let out a loud and theatrical gasp, praising the Lord. Terrence smiled so hard his face looked like it might split in two. He squeezed Brianna's hand, staring at the blurry black and white image on the screen. Dr. Evans clicked a few buttons, taking measurements and examining the fetal development. He nodded approvingly, keeping his eyes on the monitor. "Well, everything looks absolutely perfect," he said, his voice warm and professional. "The heart rate is strong, the measurements are exactly where they should be, and the development is completely on track." Terrence puffed out his chest again, looking at his mother with deep pride. "I knew it," Terrence declared loudly. "The Vance men always produce strong and healthy children." Dr. Evans smiled and clicked the mouse one more time to freeze an image on the screen. He turned to the family with a bright and congratulatory expression. "You have a very healthy baby here," he announced. "Based on the crown-to-rump length and the femur measurements, I can confirm that you are exactly 24 weeks along. Congratulations." The rhythmic thumping of the heartbeat continued to echo from the machine, but the atmosphere in the room instantly flatlined. The air was sucked out of the space with a violent force. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolutely no one moved, no one breathed. The math hung in the air like a guillotine blade suspended by a single thread. Terrence froze completely. The arrogant smile melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of sheer and utter terror. His brain scrambled to process the numbers the doctor had just spoken out loud. 24 weeks. That was exactly 6 months. Terrence had only met Brianna 16 weeks ago at a downtown cocktail lounge. They had only been sleeping together for exactly 4 months. The math did not add up. The timeline was completely impossible. Dolores was the first to physically react. The heavy designer purse she had been clutching tightly in her hands slipped from her grasp and crashed onto the linoleum floor. The loud thud broke the paralyzing silence. Her jaw dropped open and she stared at the doctor as if he had just spoken in a foreign language. 24 weeks, she whispered, her voice trembling with sudden dread. That cannot be right. My son only met this girl 4 months ago. Are you sure your machine is working properly? Dr. Evans blinked clearly, taken aback by the sudden hostility in the room. He looked down at the screen and then back at the family. I assure you, the measurements are quite precise, he said, maintaining his professional tone. At this stage of development, the sizing gives us a very accurate gestational age. She is 24 weeks pregnant. There is no margin of error that would account for a 2-month discrepancy. Tasha immediately went on the offensive. Her phone was still recording, but she quickly slammed it face down on the counter. She marched right up to the doctor, waving her manicured finger inches from his face. You need to check that machine again, she yelled, her voice echoing down the clinic hallway. You are calling my brother a fool right to his face. This is a highly respected family, and you are standing here spitting out lies. Check the machine again, because my brother did not get this girl pregnant 6 months ago. Brianna realized instantly that her entire grift was collapsing. She sat up on the examination table, clutching the paper sheet to her chest, and launched into a desperate and theatrical performance. She burst into violent tears, sobbing loudly and shaking her head. The machine is wrong, she wailed, pointing a shaking finger at the monitor. It has to be a medical anomaly. Or maybe the baby is just growing really fast because Terrence is so tall. I swear on my life, Terrence, this baby is yours. You have to believe me. The doctor does not know what he is talking about. He is completely incompetent. Dr. Evans stood his ground, his expression hardening. I am not incompetent, and my equipment is state-of-the-art, he stated firmly, shutting off the monitor and handing Brianna a towel to wipe the gel off her stomach. The medical facts are right here on the screen. If you are experiencing a discrepancy regarding paternity, that is a personal matter you need to discuss outside of my clinic. I will step out and give you some privacy to get dressed. The doctor walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The silence he left behind was infinitely more suffocating than the yelling had been. Terrence stood absolutely paralyzed, staring at the empty black screen of the ultrasound machine. His entire world was crumbling around him. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had thrown away his devoted wife. He had abandoned his daughter. He had given up his perfectly stable home. He had financed an extravagant lifestyle, taking out loans he could barely afford, all for a woman who was carrying another man's child. He was the ultimate fool. Dolores turned her furious gaze toward Brianna. Her eyes were narrowed into venomous slits. You lying little tramp, Dolores hissed, stepping toward the examination table. You thought you could trap my successful son with another man's bastard. You thought you could make a fool out of the Vance family. I will destroy you. I will drag you through the streets of Atlanta. Brianna scrambled backward, pressing her back against the wall, her fake tears continuing to stream down her face. Terrence, please, she begged, reaching her hand out toward him. Please defend me. They are attacking the mother of your child. The sound of Brianna's whining voice snapped Terrence out of his paralyzed state. He looked at his mother, whose face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. He looked at Tasha, who was already pacing the small room, muttering about how she was going to expose Brianna to everyone they knew. And then Terrence thought about the church. He thought about his colleagues at the bank. He thought about his golfing buddies at the country club. If this scene escalated any further, the clinic staff would call security. The police might arrive. The story would leak. Everyone in his elite social circle would find out that the great Terrence Vance had left his wife to raise another man's baby. The public humiliation would absolutely ruin his career and destroy his precious reputation forever. He could not afford a scandal. His ego simply could not survive the absolute mockery of his peers. Shut up! Terrence suddenly roared, silencing both his mother and his sister. Just shut your mouths right now! Dolores gasped, clutching her chest. Terrence, do not you dare raise your voice at me. This girl is a fraud. Not another word, Terrence hissed, grabbing his mother by the arm with a terrifying grip. We are not doing this here. We are not making a scene in this clinic. Get your bag, Mom. Tasha, grab your phone. We are leaving, right now. Terrence turned to Brianna, his eyes cold and dead. He did not yell at her. He did not demand the truth. The fear of public exposure completely overrode his anger. Fix your dress and get up, he commanded in a low and vibrating whisper. Walk out of here quietly. Smile at the nurses. You will not say a single word until we get back to the car. Do you understand me? Brianna nodded frantically, scrambling off the table and pulling her dress down. She wiped her face, trying to compose her theatrical features. Terrence grabbed her by the elbow, gripping her skin tightly, and marched her out of the examination room. Dolores and Tasha followed closely behind, their faces tight with suppressed rage and utter disbelief. They walked through the brightly lit clinic corridor, a twisted parade of forced composure. Terrence forced a stiff and unnatural smile as they passed the reception desk, nodding sharply at the nurses who watched them leave. Brianna kept her head down, playing the role of the tired, expectant mother. Dolores marched with rigid posture, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer purse. Tasha walked silently, her phone securely tucked away, unable to broadcast the humiliating reality of her brother's situation. They pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the sweltering Atlanta heat. The heavy and humid air wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Terrence marched them straight to his luxury SUV parked in the VIP section of the lot. He unlocked the doors with a sharp beep and shoved Brianna into the passenger seat before slamming the door shut. Dolores and Tasha climbed into the back seat, maintaining a deadly and poisonous silence. Terrence walked around to the driver's side, gripping the steering wheel as he climbed inside. He started the engine, the aggressive roar of the motor breaking the quiet parking lot. He did not put the car into gear right away. He just sat there, staring blankly through the windshield at the brick wall of the clinic. The air conditioning blasted through the vents, but it did nothing to cool the boiling tension inside the vehicle. The silence in the car was heavy and dangerous. It was the crushing weight of a shattered ego and a ruined legacy. No one dared to speak. No one dared to ask the obvious question about what came next. The proud and untouchable Vance family had just been brought to their knees by a 24-year-old grifter, and they were completely trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance. The drive back to the suburban house was a masterclass in suffocating and toxic tension. Terrence gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned a ghostly white, holding his breath as the heavy silence pressed down on his chest. In the back seat, Dolores muttered quiet prayers under her breath, her hands trembling as she clutched her designer purse. Tasha sat beside her, frantically texting her friends but completely terrified to speak out loud. Brianna sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She played the role of the terrified and vulnerable victim, keeping her head bowed, but behind her curtain of long hair, her mind was rapidly calculating her next move. She knew the golden goose was slipping from her grasp, and she needed a flawless strategy to secure her payout. Terrence dropped his mother and sister off at their pristine home first. He did not say a single word as they exited the vehicle. He just stared straight ahead, waiting for the heavy doors to slam shut. Dolores paused on the driveway, demanding that Terrence call her the moment he got home, but he simply rolled up the tinted window and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires screeched against the pavement as he sped away, desperate to isolate Brianna and tear the truth out of her. When Terrence finally pulled into the driveway of the massive house he had practically stolen from Keisha, he threw the vehicle into park and killed the engine. He turned his body to face the woman who had just humiliated him. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice a low and dangerous growl. Brianna unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. She walked up the paved driveway with a slow and deliberate sway, completely dropping the frightened act she had displayed at the clinic. She unlocked the heavy oak front door and walked into the grand foyer, tossing her keys carelessly onto the console table. Terrence stormed in right behind her, slamming the door so violently the framed mirrors on the wall rattled against the paint. The charade was officially over. He backed her against the marble kitchen counter, his eyes blazing with absolute unhinged fury. "You think you can play me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty and hollow rooms. "You think you can walk into that clinic pregnant with some other man's child and completely humiliate me in front of my own mother? I want a DNA test. I want a needle in your stomach tomorrow morning, or I am throwing you out on the street exactly like I did to Keisha. You will leave this house with absolutely nothing." Brianna did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not beg for his forgiveness. Instead, she threw her head back and let out a loud and genuine laugh. The sound was sharp, mocking, and completely devoid of fear. It sliced right through Terrence's aggressive posture. He stepped back, completely caught off guard by her sheer audacity. "Are you crazy?" he demanded, pointing a shaking finger at her face. "I am talking about throwing you out into the gutter, and you are standing in my kitchen laughing at me." Brianna casually walked past him, heading toward the refrigerator. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the granite island, crossing her ankles. "You are not going to throw me out, Terrence," she said, taking a slow sip from her glass. "You are going to do exactly what I tell you to do." Terrence scoffed, taking a menacing step toward her. "I am not doing anything for a lying tramp who tries to pass off another man's bastard as a Vance." Brianna set the glass down with a sharp and deliberate clink. "A bastard," she repeated, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Well, we both know it certainly is not a Vance, because the great Terrence Vance, the powerful bank manager, the pride of his mother's highly esteemed church congregation, cannot even have children." Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, threatening to crack his chest open. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by fear. Brianna smiled a wicked and victorious grin. "Oh yes, Terrence, I know the truth," she purred, walking slowly back toward him, circling him like a predator. "I know all about the experimental prescription medication you took 3 years ago. I know all about the severe side effects. I know about your secret trips to that specialist out of state. I know that you are completely and permanently sterile. I know that you never even told your loyal wife the truth. You just let Keisha go through years of agonizing fertility treatments, letting her inject herself with hormones and cry over negative pregnancy tests. You let your awful mother blame Keisha for being a barren and useless wife, when the entire time the problem was you. You are firing blanks, Terrence. You always have been. Have." Terrence felt the enormous room spinning around him. He had guarded that medical secret with his very life. His entire identity, his entire standing in the Atlanta business world, and his prominent religious community was built entirely on his image as a virile and powerful alpha male. If anyone ever found out the truth, he would be the absolute laughingstock of the city. His mother would be devastated and humiliated. His arrogant friends at the country club would mock him relentlessly behind his back. The immense shame would completely destroy his carefully curated public persona. How do you know that he choked out, his voice reduced to a pathetic and raspy whisper? Brianna tapped her manicured fingernail against his expensive silk tie. "When you leave a girl alone in your massive house all day, she tends to get bored, Terrence. I found your hidden medical file tucked away in the back of your home office safe. You really should remember to scramble your lock codes. It took me about 10 minutes to guess your birthday and pull the door wide open. I took high-definition photos of every single document, every diagnosis, and every doctor's note." She stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest and looking him up and down with utter disgust. "So here is exactly how this is going to work," she announced, her voice dripping with absolute and terrifying authority. "We are going to continue this beautiful little charade. You are going to tell your mother and your nosy sister that the doctor was simply mistaken about the timeline. You will say the machine was poorly calibrated, or that it is just a very large baby because you have such superior genetics. And when I give birth, we are going to tell everyone in your precious church that the baby came 2 months premature. We will pay off whatever private doctor we need to make the hospital paperwork look completely legitimate. And in exchange for my absolute silence, you are going to take very good care of me." "You are out of your mind," Terrence sputtered, trying desperately to regain some semblance of masculine control. "I am not paying to raise another man's kid. I will not be your personal ATM." Brianna shrugged, pulling her smartphone from her designer pocket. "Suit yourself," she said casually, tapping the screen. "I have the medical records saved right here in a dedicated folder. I can post them to my Instagram story right now. I can tag your mother's revered pastor." I can tag your boss at the bank. I can tag every single judgmental woman in your sister's social circle. I will let the whole world know that the big and powerful Terrence Vance is completely impotent and that he kicks innocent women out on the street to hide his own embarrassing physical flaws. Should I hit the send button right now, Terrence? Should we watch your reputation burn together? Terrence held his hands up in complete and pathetic defeat. His breathing was heavy, ragged, and desperate. He was entirely cornered. His massive, fragile ego and his desperate need to be worshipped and respected had perfectly trapped him in a cage of his own making. He could not lose his social standing. He would rather die than face the humiliation and pity of the people he spent his entire life trying to impress. "Okay," he whispered, his shoulders slumping as his dominance completely evaporated. "Okay, Brianna. What do you want?" Brianna's eyes sparkled with greedy triumph. "First of all, I am not staying in this dreary suburban trap," she declared, gesturing around the massive kitchen with a look of utter disdain. "I want a luxury downtown apartment. A penthouse in Buckhead with floor-to-ceiling windows and a private balcony with a view of the city skyline. I want the lease exclusively in my name, but you are going to pay the rent a full year in advance. Second, I want a platinum credit card with absolutely no spending limit so I can furnish the nursery and buy my maternity clothes exactly how I want to. And finally, I have been eyeing a very specific Birkin bag. It costs $20,000. I expect it sitting on my brand new kitchen counter by the end of the week. Do we have a deal, Terrence?" Terrence stared at her, feeling physically sick to his stomach. The financial demands were absolutely astronomical. He was already drowning in massive debt from trying to keep up his fake appearances. The house was heavily mortgaged. He had maxed out his personal credit lines to buy his luxury cars and his custom-tailored suits just to impress women like her. He had absolutely no liquid cash left to his name. But looking at Brianna holding her phone ready to press a button that would publicly destroy his life, he knew he had absolutely no other choice. "Deal," he muttered, staring down at the expensive hardwood floor, completely defeated. Brianna smiled radiantly, showing all of her teeth. "Excellent," she chirped, tossing her phone back into her pocket. "I am going to go upstairs and pack my bags right now. I expect the keys to my new penthouse by tomorrow evening. Do not keep me waiting." She turned on her heel and walked up the grand staircase, leaving Terrence standing completely alone in the massive kitchen he could no longer afford. Terrence gripped the edge of the granite counter, feeling the walls of his entire life closing in on him. His chest heaved with quiet and desperate panic. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened his contacts list. He scrolled past his banking colleagues, his wealthy friends, and his church members, settling on a name he had hoped to never use. It was a private lender known in the underground scene for providing massive amounts of fast cash with predatory and ruthless interest rates. It was the kind of shady loan that destroyed lives and violently dismantled businesses. With a trembling and sweaty finger, Terrence pressed the call button. He raised the phone to his ear, listening to the ringtone echo in the silent and oppressive house. He had traded a loyal and brilliant wife for an absolute nightmare, and now he was willingly walking directly into his own financial slaughter simply to protect his foolish pride. While Terrence was busy building a house of cards over a swamp of debt, I was standing in the freezing wind off Lake Michigan, staring up at a glittering skyscraper in the Gold Coast. Chicago was a brutal city. The cold cut right through my designer trench coat, but I did not care. The biting wind felt like an absolute baptism. The suffocating heat of Atlanta and the heavy judgmental stares of the Vance family were completely behind me. I had traded the toxicity of my past for a blank canvas, and I was ready to paint my masterpiece. My new high-end real estate staging company was still in its infancy, but my ambition was absolutely massive. I had poured a portion of my grandfather's trust fund into securing a sleek office space downtown and hiring a small but fiercely loyal team of assistants. We were hungry, we were aggressive, and we were currently hunting the biggest white whale in the Chicago real estate market. The target was a stunning $15 million penthouse occupying the entire top floor of a newly constructed glass and steel tower. It featured panoramic views of the city's skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an expansive open-concept layout that demanded absolute perfection. The owner of this magnificent property was Marcus Sterling. He was a 32-year-old African-American tech mogul who had recently sold his software startup for over $1 billion. Marcus was young, brilliant, and notoriously demanding. He wanted to sell the penthouse to upgrade to an even larger estate in the suburbs, and he needed a staging firm that could transform the empty space into an irresistible luxury oasis for potential international buyers. Securing this contract meant a guaranteed six-figure retainer and an instant reputation in the elite circles of luxury real estate. I wanted that contract. I needed that contract. I had spent 3 grueling weeks preparing the ultimate pitch. However, I was not the only one chasing the Sterling penthouse. The Chicago staging scene was dominated by a handful of legacy firms run by women who had been holding a monopoly on the luxury market for decades. My primary rival was a ruthless woman named Victoria Croft. Victoria ran the oldest and most prestigious staging firm in the city. She was accustomed to sweeping up every multi-million-dollar contract without breaking a sweat, and she absolutely despised the fact that a newcomer from Atlanta was threatening her territory. Victoria played dirty. She had deep pockets and deep connections, and she was not above using underhanded tactics to crush her competition before they could even get off the ground. 2 days before the final presentation for Marcus Sterling disaster struck. I walked into my office at 6 in the morning, clutching a hot coffee, only to find my lead assistant sitting at her desk with tears streaming down her face. She looked up at me in absolute panic and delivered the crushing blow. Our entire vendor list had been compromised. Victoria Croft had somehow paid off one of our junior contractors to leak my master spreadsheet. This list contained the names, direct contact numbers, and exclusive pricing agreements for every single luxury furniture supplier, custom upholsterer, and high-end lighting fabricator I had carefully sourced over the past 2 months. But Victoria did not just steal the list, she actively weaponized it. She had her massive corporate team call every single one of my vendors, placing massive holds on all their premium inventory, and essentially buying out the entire supply chain for the exact dates of the Sterling installation. When my team called to confirm our luxury rental pieces for the pitch, the vendors apologetically informed us that their stock was completely depleted. Victoria had effectively frozen me out of the market. She had taken my sleek Italian leather sofas, my imported crystal chandeliers, and my custom silk drapery right out from under me. I was left with an empty $15 million penthouse to stage and absolutely zero high-end furniture to put inside it. My assistant was hyperventilating, convinced that our brand new company was going to be completely destroyed before it even launched. She suggested we call Marcus Sterling and beg for an extension, or simply withdraw our bid entirely to save face. I stood in the middle of my office, looking at the blank whiteboards where my pristine design plans had been pinned just hours earlier. I thought about Terrence throwing my suitcase onto the grass. I thought about Dolores laughing at my supposed inadequacy. A fierce, burning fire ignited in my chest. I was not going to quit. I was not going to let a wealthy legacy firm bully me out of my destiny. I was going to beat Victoria Croft at her own game by completely changing the rules. I grabbed a black marker and marched over to the whiteboard. I crossed out the sterile generic luxury designs I had originally planned. If Victoria wanted the imported Italian leather and the predictable crystal chandeliers, she could keep them. I was going to give Marcus Sterling something money could not easily buy. I was going to give him absolute authenticity. I realized that a young, brilliant African-American billionaire did not want a home that looked like a sterile European hotel lobby. He wanted a space that reflected his culture, his modern success, and his unique identity. I pivoted my entire strategy. I abandoned the corporate supply chain completely and decided to tap into the vibrant, beating heart of the city itself. I spent the next 48 hours executing a relentless and exhausting hustle. I did not sleep for a single minute. I drove my SUV into the south side of Chicago, visiting underground art galleries, community art spaces, and independent workshops. I pulled every favor I could muster. I negotiated directly with brilliant local Black artists, purchasing massive raw canvas paintings that vibrated with bold colors and powerful cultural narratives. I found a brilliant metal sculptor working out of a converted warehouse and commissioned him to create a stunning geometric centerpiece for the penthouse foyer made entirely of brushed brass and dark copper. I bypassed the luxury furniture showrooms entirely and went directly to independent carpenters sourcing dining tables made from reclaimed urban mahogany and chairs upholstered in rich textured mudcloth imported directly from West Africa. I layered these raw, authentic pieces with sleek, modern metallic accents, creating a design aesthetic that was profoundly luxurious but deeply rooted in Afro-modern culture. It was bold, it was soulful, it was completely original. The morning of the pitch arrived with a crisp and unforgiving chill in the air. I walked into the massive, empty penthouse wearing a tailored emerald green suit, carrying nothing but my tablet and a series of high-definition rendering boards. Victoria Croft was already there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with her team of assistants. She gave me a condescending smile, clearly expecting me to walk in empty-handed and admit defeat. She presented her pitch first. It was exactly what I expected. It was beautiful but entirely soulless. She showed Marcus Sterling digital mock-ups of the exact same Italian sofas and generic luxury pieces she had stolen from my list. It looked like every other expensive property in the city. Marcus sat in his chair listening politely, but his eyes lacked any real spark of excitement. He was looking at a space that anyone with enough money could replicate. When it was my turn, I confidently stepped to the center of the room. I did not apologize. I did not mention the sabotage. I simply placed my rendering boards on the easel and began to weave a narrative. I pitched a vision of luxury that elevated culture rather than erasing it. I showed him the massive bespoke artwork from the Southside painters, emphasizing the bold brushstrokes that commanded attention. I showed him the reclaimed wood textures, the vibrant mudcloth fabrics, and the modern metallic sculptures that would reflect the city lights. I explained how the staging would tell a story of modern Black excellence, creating an emotional resonance that would make international buyers feel the unique pulse of the space. I explained that true luxury was not about importing the most expensive velvet from Italy. True luxury was about curation, intention, and history. I did not just offer him furniture. I offered him a masterpiece of cultural architecture that perfectly mirrored his own ascent to greatness. Marcus Sterling sat in absolute stunned silence as I finished my presentation. He looked at Victoria's generic corporate boards, and then he looked at the vibrant, soulful renderings I had placed in front of him. A slow and powerful smile spread across his face, lighting up his entire expression. He stood up from his chair, walked directly over to me, and extended his hand. He ignored Victoria completely, leaving her standing by the windows with her mouth slightly open in shock. He told me that my vision was the most authentic and breathtaking design he had ever seen in the luxury market. He loved the inclusion of local artists and the bold, unapologetic embrace of Afro-modern aesthetics. He did not even bother negotiating the price or the terms of the agreement. Right there in the middle of the empty penthouse overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, Marcus Sterling signed the contract. He had his assistant cut a massive six-figure retainer check on the spot and handed it to me with a look of absolute respect. Victoria Croft turned completely pale, gathering her generic materials and marching out of the penthouse in absolute humiliation. Her entire team followed behind her, completely defeated. She had tried to bury me with her wealth and her corporate connections, but her sabotage had only forced me to dig deeper into my own genius. I stood by the massive windows, looking down at the bustling city below, holding a life-changing contract in my hand. Terrence and his toxic family were 1,000,000 miles away, trapped in their miserable web of lies and debt. Meanwhile, I had just single-handedly conquered the Chicago real estate market on my own terms. Keisha Vance had officially arrived and my empire was just beginning to rise. While I was busy dominating the luxury real estate market in Chicago, a very different reality was unfolding nearly 700 miles away in Atlanta. Terrence was completely drowning. The crushing weight of his monumental arrogance was finally dragging him straight to the bottom of a financial ocean. Brianna was bleeding him dry with absolute precision. She had moved into the massive downtown penthouse he had secured for her, and she was treating his bank accounts like an unlimited, endless fountain of cash. She had completely maxed out the new credit lines he had desperately opened to buy custom nursery furniture, imported Italian baby clothes, and the $20,000 Birkin bag she had extorted from him. Every single time Terrence tried to push back or beg her to slow down her spending, Brianna simply tapped her perfectly manicured fingernails against her phone screen. It was a silent and terrifying reminder that she held the absolute power to post his sterile medical records online and completely obliterate his carefully constructed alpha male reputation. He was trapped in an expensive nightmare of his own making, and the walls were closing in fast. The high-interest loans he had secretly taken out from predatory underground lenders were now compounding at an aggressive and terrifying rate. He was receiving threatening phone calls at his bank branch office, and the collection notices were piling up in his mailbox. Terrence needed cash, and he needed it immediately. His ego was so massive and his delusions so deep that he actually convinced himself I was the solution to his self-inflicted poverty. He assumed because I had walked away quietly that I was weak. He figured I was struggling in Chicago, scraping by to raise our daughter alone, and that a sudden legal attack would terrify me into a quick financial settlement just to make him go away. He hired a sleazy, aggressively cheap lawyer in Atlanta and filed a vicious interstate lawsuit against me. The legal documents arrived at my sleek new downtown Chicago office via certified mail on a bright Tuesday morning. I sat at my massive glass desk and read through the pages with a mixture of utter disgust and complete amusement. Terrence was suing me for retroactive child support. He was demanding full primary custody of Aaliyah and claiming that I had essentially kidnapped our daughter by crossing state lines without his explicit written permission. He painted a completely fictional narrative of a heartbroken father who had been violently separated from his only child. The paperwork demanded that I immediately return Aaliyah to Atlanta and pay him thousands of dollars a month in support to compensate for his alleged emotional distress and financial suffering. As if the ridiculous lawsuit was not enough, his mother decided to insert herself into the drama. The very same afternoon I was served with the papers, my phone buzzed with a series of incoming voicemails. Dolores had bypassed my blocked numbers list by using a prepaid phone. I sat in my quiet office, pressed the phone to my ear, and listened to the vile poison spilling from her mouth. "Keisha, you listen to me, you worthless little girl," Dolores hissed, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You really thought you could just steal a Vance child and run off to the frozen tundra. You thought you could take my granddaughter away from this highly respected family. Terrence is going to drag you through the absolute mud in front of a judge. We are going to expose you as an unfit mother. We are going to prove that you stole my son from his home and ran away like a coward. We are going to take Aaliyah away from you and bring her back to a real family where she belongs. You better pack her bags and wire my son the money you owe him before we absolutely destroy whatever pathetic little life you are trying to build up there." I listened to the entire frantic, hateful message without my heart rate increasing by a single beat. 2 years ago, a voicemail like that from Dolores would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have cried. I would have questioned myself. I would have worried about their influence and their connections in the Atlanta church community. But the woman sitting in that Chicago office was not the same woman they had verbally abused and kicked to the curb. I was a business owner holding a massive contract with a billionaire tech mogul. I had a fully funded trust account and an ironclad sense of my own power. I calmly deleted the voicemail, tossed my phone onto the desk, and buzzed my assistant. I told her to pull up the contact information for the most ruthless, highly rated family law attorney in the entire state of Illinois. I did not want a peacemaker. I did not want a mediator. I wanted an absolute shark who enjoyed tearing predatory lawsuits to shreds. Within 2 hours, I was sitting across from a senior partner at a top-tier downtown law firm. She wore a sharp gray suit, had eyes like a hawk, and charged $1,000 an hour. I slid Terrence's ridiculous lawsuit across her polished desk. Then I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. I slid that across the desk right next to the lawsuit. My lawyer picked up the second document and adjusted her glasses. As she read through the pages, a slow, sharp smile spread across her face. "This is incredible," she said, looking up at me with genuine professional admiration. "Did he actually sign this without having independent counsel review it?" I nodded, leaning back in my chair with absolute confidence. He absolutely did, I replied. The document was the final divorce decree. Back in Atlanta, when Terrence was entirely consumed by his lust for Brianna and his desperate need to clear me out of the house, he had been incredibly impatient. He wanted the divorce finalized immediately so he could parade his new mistress around without any legal complications. He also wanted to ensure he kept the large 5-bedroom suburban house to impress her. His massive ego convinced him that the house was the only asset of real value, and he was terrified I would demand half the equity. I had known exactly how to play his greed against him. I told him he could have the house free and clear. I told him I would not touch his retirement accounts or his bank investments. I played the role of the defeated submissive woman who just wanted to run away quietly. In exchange, I presented him with a custom-drafted custody agreement. It explicitly stated that in order for him to retain 100% of the marital assets and the real estate property, he had to legally and permanently relinquish all parental rights and all future financial claims over Aaliyah. It essentially severed his legal tie to our daughter, making me the sole custodial parent with absolute physical and legal authority, regardless of what state I chose to reside in. Terrence had been so blindingly focused on keeping his precious house and rushing into his new life with Brianna that he barely glanced at the paperwork. He saw that his money and his property were protected, and he eagerly signed his name on the dotted line, completely signing away his rights to Aaliyah in the process. His arrogance had made him legally blind. My Chicago lawyer immediately went to work. She did not even bother entertaining a mediation session or scheduling a prolonged phone call with Terrence's cheap attorney. She simply drafted a lethal, brilliantly worded response and filed it directly with the court. The response attached the fully executed, notarized, and legally binding divorce decree, completely proving that Terrence had zero legal standing to demand custody, child support, or dictate where Aaliyah lived. He had explicitly signed away those exact rights in exchange for a house that was now ironically sending him into bankruptcy. My lawyer also filed a severe counter-motion demanding that Terrence pay for every single penny of my legal fees for forcing me to defend against a blatantly frivolous and legally baseless lawsuit. She cited his harassment, the threatening voicemails from his mother, and his clear intent to weaponize the legal system for extortion. The entire matter was resolved faster than Terrence could even blink. The judge reviewed the documents and saw exactly what was happening. Terrence was attempting to manipulate the court to squeeze money out of his ex-wife after willingly abandoning his parental rights for real estate. The judge was absolutely furious at the blatant waste of the court's time. The ruling was handed down with brutal swiftness. Terrence's lawsuit was completely dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could never bring these ridiculous claims before the court ever again. Furthermore, the judge fully granted my lawyer's counter-motion. Terrence was officially ordered to pay my substantial legal fees in full within 30 days. If he failed to produce the cash, he would be held in contempt of court. I was sitting in my living room looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline when my lawyer called to deliver the news. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and listened as she detailed the complete and total legal massacre. Terrence had tried to attack me out of pure desperation, and his attack had completely blown up in his face. He had not only failed to extract a single dime from me, but he was now legally on the hook for thousands of dollars in high-end attorney fees that he absolutely could not afford. Back in Atlanta, the news of the judge's ruling struck the Vance household like a fatal lightning bolt. Terrence had completely banked on scoring a quick payout to pacify Brianna and keep his terrible secret hidden. Now he was staring at a massive legal bill on top of the extortion money, the luxury apartment rent, and his completely suffocating debt. His arrogant plan had backfired with devastating precision. He had handed over all his rights to Aaliyah to keep a house he was about to lose, and he was paying extortion money to raise a baby that belonged to another man. The walls were not just closing in on him, they were actively crushing him. I took a slow sip of my wine, enjoying the rich, complex flavor. Dolores's threatening voicemails were completely powerless. Terrence's legal threats were absolute garbage. They were drowning in the toxic swamp they had created for themselves, and I was standing safely on the shore, completely untouchable. I turned my phone on silent, pulled out my sketchbook, and began drafting brand new concepts for the Sterling penthouse, completely unbothered by the glorious destruction happening down south. I had an empire to build. 600 miles south, the blistering Georgia heat was baking the pavement outside a highly exclusive Buckhead salon, but inside, the air conditioning was blasting at a freezing temperature. Tasha Vance sat under a chrome drying hood, sipping complimentary sparkling water from a tall crystal flute. She was trying desperately to maintain the illusion of her family's pristine wealth, but the cracks were beginning to show everywhere she looked. Her premium credit card had been shockingly declined twice that very morning, and she was currently using a backup card with a terrifyingly high interest rate just to pay for her weekly blowout. She needed to look absolutely perfect for her judgmental social circle, but the suffocating stress of her brother's financial collapse was spilling over onto her own life. Her friends were already whispering about Terrence's sudden divorce and his scandalous new pregnant girlfriend. Tasha desperately needed a distraction from the looming ruin of the Vance family name. Tasha reached with freshly manicured fingers toward the stack of glossy publications resting on the marble side table. She bypassed the local gossip tabloids and grabbed a thick premium publication with a heavy matte cover. It was the latest issue of Luxury Homes Chicago. She idly flipped through the first few pages, not really paying attention to the articles about Midwestern architecture until her eyes locked onto a massive 2-page center spread and her entire body completely froze. Tasha gasped so loudly she choked on her sparkling water. The delicate crystal flute slipped from her trembling hand and shattered against the imported Italian tile floor. But she did not even notice the mess. She was staring at a full-page high-definition photograph of her former sister-in-law. It was not the quiet, submissive Keisha who used to serve them sweet tea in the suburbs and quietly take their verbal abuse. This woman was an absolute titan. Keisha was wearing a sharply tailored emerald green power suit, standing confidently in the center of a breathtaking penthouse, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Chicago skyline. The bold metallic sculptures and rich authentic Afro-modern artwork popped right off the glossy page, radiating absolute luxury and power. But it was the headline that made Tasha's blood run completely cold. It was printed in massive gold foil lettering across the top of the page. Chicago's new staging queen, how Keisha Vance transformed the $15 million Sterling penthouse and redefined luxury. Tasha did not wait for her stylist to return. She did not wait for her hair to finish drying. She threw a crumpled $100 bill onto the reception counter, grabbed her designer purse, and bolted out the heavy glass doors, clutching the magazine to her chest like a ticking time bomb. She practically flew to her mother's house, breaking several traffic laws in her desperate rush to deliver the devastating news. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, completely consumed by a toxic mixture of shock and profound jealousy. When Tasha burst through the heavy oak doors of Dolores's pristine suburban home, she found Terrence sitting at the massive kitchen island with his head buried in his hands. He looked absolutely terrible. His usually crisp designer suit was heavily wrinkled, and dark, heavy circles hung under his bloodshot eyes. He was in the middle of begging his mother for a personal loan to cover the astronomical rent for Brianna's penthouse. Dolores was pacing the kitchen floor, her face twisted in a bitter scowl, lecturing him about fiscal responsibility while completely ignoring her own role in encouraging his disastrous life choices. "Look!" Tasha screamed, slamming the heavy magazine down onto the granite countertop right in front of her brother's face. "Just look at this right now!" Terrence flinched at the loud smack but slowly lifted his heavy head. His bleary eyes focused on the glossy cover and then moved to the center spread Tasha had aggressively ripped open. For a long, terrifying moment, the massive kitchen was absolutely dead silent. Terrence stared at the radiant photograph of his ex-wife. He stared at the $15 million price tag printed in bold black ink. He read the word staging queen over and over again until the letters blurred together in front of his eyes. Dolores stopped pacing and marched over to the island, snatching the magazine from the counter with her claw-like hands. She adjusted her reading glasses and rapidly scanned the article. Her face turned an alarming shade of crimson and her hands began to shake violently. "This is impossible!" Dolores shrieked, her voice echoing sharply off the high vaulted ceilings. That useless little mouse could not even pick out decent curtains for your guest room. How on earth is she standing in a $15 million penthouse in Chicago acting like she owns the entire city? Terrence felt a wave of absolute sickening rage wash over him. It was a suffocating, toxic mixture of deep humiliation and overwhelming jealousy that burned his throat. He was currently drowning in predatory debt. He was being mercilessly extorted by a ruthless mistress who was carrying another man's child. He was facing total professional ruin and severe social embarrassment. His entire life was a burning shipwreck. And yet there was Keisha, the woman he had thrown out onto the street with nothing but a single suitcase and a broken heart. She was not crying in a tiny apartment. She was not begging to come back to him. She was thriving on a level he could not even comprehend. She looked radiant, powerful, wealthy, and entirely untouchable. She stole from me. Terrence suddenly, a low, dangerous growl vibrating in his chest. He slammed his fist against the granite counter so hard his knuckles immediately bruised. That is the only possible explanation. She stole from my bank accounts while we were married. She actively hid marital assets from me. There is absolutely no way she built a high-end luxury staging empire in a few months without massive amounts of seed capital. She funneled my hard-earned money into a secret offshore account and used it to launch this Chicago business behind my back. It was a completely delusional and legally baseless theory. Keisha had used her own grandfather's trust fund money, which Terrence had never even bothered to know about because he was entirely too obsessed with himself. But Terrence was a desperate man, and desperate men create their own highly convenient realities. His massive, fragile ego simply could not accept that Keisha was brilliant enough to succeed without him. He desperately needed to believe she was a calculating thief, because the alternative that she was simply better, stronger, and smarter than him was psychologically devastating. "You are absolutely right," Dolores declared, her eyes flashing with greedy vindication. "She drained you dry, Terrence. She played the role of the quiet, obedient little wife while secretly plotting to steal your wealth and build her own empire. We are not going to let her get away with this treason. We are the Vance family. Nobody embarrasses us, steals our money, and walks away rich." Tasha nodded vigorously, leaning over the counter with a hungry look in her eyes. "You have to sue her, Terrence. She built that company while you two were still legally married. That means half of everything she owns belongs to you by law. 50% of her company, 50% of her lucrative contracts, 50% of whatever massive check she made off that billionaire tech mogul." A twisted, sinister smile slowly crept across Terrence's face. The crushing weight of his debt suddenly felt a little lighter. He did not see Keisha as an ex-wife anymore. He saw her as a massive walking ATM. He saw a golden ticket out of his miserable financial nightmare. "I am going to take half of her company," he whispered, his voice trembling with newfound greed and manic energy. "I'm going to take half of her entire empire, and I'm going to leave her with absolutely nothing, just like she deserves." Terrence did not waste a single second. He immediately left his mother's house and drove straight to the shadowy edge of the Atlanta legal district. He ignored the prestigious family law firms with their polished mahogany doors and strict ethical standards. He needed a completely different breed of lawyer for this kind of warfare. He walked into a dimly lit office located above a noisy bail bondsman and sat down with a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a predatory, ruthless shark of an attorney who specialized in aggressive asset recovery and vicious divorce modifications. He worked exclusively on contingency, meaning he took a massive cut of the winnings, but required very little money up front. He was legally notorious for destroying lives, bankrupting ex-spouses, and burying innocent people in endless paperwork. Terrence threw the luxury magazine onto Marcus Thorne's cluttered, dusty desk. "My ex-wife is hiding millions of dollars in marital assets," Terrence declared, leaning forward with a predatory glint in his eye. "She funneled my money into a secret business venture while we were married, and she just launched a massive luxury staging empire in Chicago. I want 50% of her company. I want a forensic audit of every single bank account she owns. I want her completely exposed, and I want my money back with interest. Marcus Thorne picked up the magazine and whistled softly as he looked at the glossy photos of the sterling penthouse and the bold headlines. He saw the massive dollar signs flashing before his eyes. "We can absolutely tear her apart," Marcus said, tapping his expensive pen against the desk with a wicked grin. "We will file an emergency injunction in the Atlanta family court, claiming she committed egregious financial fraud during the marriage. We will demand a complete retroactive division of assets. If she is making the kind of money this article implies, we are going to make her bleed. I will freeze her corporate accounts in Chicago before she even knows what hit her." Terrence signed the contingency agreement with a bold, aggressive flourish. He felt completely invincible. He felt like the powerful, dominant alpha male he had always pretended to be. He walked out of the sleazy law office feeling 10 feet tall. He had just launched a nuclear missile at Keisha's new life, and he was entirely ready to watch her empire burn to the ground. He drove his luxury car straight to the expensive downtown penthouse he was currently renting for Brianna. He swiped his keycard and took the private elevator to the top floor. He walked through the heavy mahogany doors and found Brianna lounging on a white leather sofa, scrolling through her phone. She was wearing a silk robe and surrounded by several expensive shopping bags from upscale baby boutiques. The brand new $20,000 Birkin bag sat proudly on the glass coffee table like a hard-won trophy. Brianna looked up at him with an expression of sheer boredom and mild irritation. "You are late, Terrence," she drawled, tossing her phone onto the cushions. "The interior designer for the nursery needs another $10,000 deposit by tomorrow morning. I suggest you figure out which credit card is not maxed out yet, because I am not waiting around for you to find the cash." Instead of cowering or making pathetic excuses, Terrence simply chuckled. He walked over to the coffee table and slapped the Luxury Homes Chicago magazine right next to her precious Birkin bag. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his silk tie, looking down at her with absolute supreme arrogance. "You can buy whatever you want for that nursery, Brianna," he announced, his voice booming confidently through the expansive penthouse. "You can hire the best designers in the entire city. You can buy 10 more Birkin bags if you feel like it." Brianna raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, looking at him with deep suspicion. She slowly sat up, crossing her arms over her chest. "Are you drunk, Terrence? We both know you are completely broke. You have been sweating over loan sharks for a month. Where exactly do you think this magical money is coming from?" Terrence tapped his index finger against the glossy cover of the magazine right over Keisha's smiling, confident face. He leaned down, his eyes wide with unhinged greed and absolute delusion. "It is coming from her," he whispered, a wicked, victorious smile stretching across his face. "My pathetic little ex-wife apparently struck gold in Chicago. She used my money to build a massive luxury real estate empire, and I just hired the most vicious lawyer in Atlanta to take 50% of everything she owns. We are not broke, Brianna. We are about to be filthy, incredibly rich. We are going to take her for every single dime she has, and there is absolutely nothing she can do to stop me." The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse loomed ahead, looking exactly the same as they did the day my divorce was finalized. But the woman walking through them was entirely different. I stepped out of the sleek black town car my Chicago team had arranged, wearing a sharp tailored charcoal suit that screamed quiet wealth and absolute authority. The suffocating humidity of Atlanta wrapped around me, but I felt completely cool. I was not the broken, discarded wife who had fled this city with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered heart. I was a CEO. I was a force. And I was walking into this preliminary hearing fully prepared to dismantle Terrence Vance for the very last time. I walked through the marble corridors with my high-powered Chicago attorney Evelyn Hayes walking confidently by my side. Evelyn was a terrifyingly sharp legal predator who charged exorbitant fees and absolutely refused to lose. I had flown her down to Georgia specifically for this ambush. We did not speak as we approached the courtroom doors because our strategy was already locked in place. We simply waited for the circus to arrive. Right on cue, the elevator doors down the hall slid open, and the Vance family strutted into the lobby. They looked like a walking caricature of unearned wealth and overwhelming delusion. Terrence was wearing a flashy leased navy blue suit with a silk pocket square that was entirely too bright for a morning court appearance. He had a brand new luxury watch gleaming on his wrist, clearly purchased on another disastrous line of high-interest credit to project an image of success. He walked with his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk plastered across his face, as if he was walking into a bank to cash a winning lottery ticket. Flanking him like greedy vultures were Dolores and Tasha. They walked with their noses completely in the air, acting as if my hard-earned money was already sitting in their bank accounts. Dolores was wearing an oversized church hat and practically vibrating with vindictive excitement, ready to watch me lose everything. Tasha strutted beside her, carrying a knockoff designer bag, looking around the hallway to make sure everyone noticed their grand entrance. They were completely blinded by their own greed. Terrence spotted me standing quietly by the courtroom doors. His smirk widened into a look of absolute supreme arrogance. He leaned over and whispered something to his sleazy attorney Marcus Thorne, who let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. They truly believed I was a terrified amateur. They believed their aggressive legal tactics had forced me to fly down here to beg for a settlement. I simply stared back at them, my expression completely blank, revealing absolutely nothing. When the bailiff finally called us into the courtroom, we took our seats. Judge Harrison, a seasoned and utterly no-nonsense magistrate, took his place at the bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of emergency motions Marcus Thorne had aggressively filed. Marcus Thorne immediately jumped to his feet, launching into a highly theatrical and entirely fictional opening statement. Your Honor, we are here today because of a massive, calculated, and highly orchestrated financial deception. He boomed, his voice echoing loudly through the quiet courtroom. My client, Terrence Vance, was the sole financial provider for his family. He worked tirelessly as a prominent bank manager to support his wife. And how did she repay him? By quietly siphoning marital funds, by funneling his hard-earned money into secret offshore accounts, by plotting her escape while they were still legally married. Thorne paced back and forth, pointing an aggressive finger in my direction. She used my client's wealth to launch a massive luxury real estate staging empire in Chicago. She hid these assets during their recent divorce proceedings, intentionally defrauding my client of what is rightfully his. We are demanding an immediate emergency freeze on all corporate accounts associated with Keisha Vance's Chicago firm. We demand a full forensic audit and a 50% equitable division of all business assets. My client is entitled to half of her entire empire. Terrence sat at the plaintiff's table, nodding solemnly. He perfectly played the role of the tragic, betrayed husband who had been robbed blind by a deceitful wife. Behind him in the gallery, Dolores let out a loud, dramatic sigh of agreement, while Tasha glared daggers at the back of my head. They were entirely convinced that they had just won. They were already spending my millions in their heads. I sat perfectly still next to Evelyn. I did not flinch. I did not object. I just let Marcus Thorne dig a massive, inescapable grave for his arrogant client. When Thorne finally finished his dramatic speech and took his seat, panting slightly from the exertion, Judge Harrison turned his gaze to our table. Counsel, do you have a response to these severe allegations? The judge asked, his tone skeptical but attentive. Evelyn Hayes stood up slowly, gracefully smoothing the front of her expensive blazer. She did not raise her voice. She did not pace. She radiated absolute, lethal calm. Your Honor, opposing counsel has certainly painted a vivid and highly imaginative picture of marital fraud. She began, her tone dripping with polite condescension. It is quite a creative work of fiction. However, we do not need to waste this court's valuable time authorizing forensic audits, digging through bank statements, or arguing over the timeline of my client's business inception. The entire premise of this lawsuit is legally void. Marcus Thorne scoffed loudly from his table. My client has absolute legal standing to demand half of any marital asset hidden during the marriage, Thorne snapped. Evelyn completely ignored him. She reached into her sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp document encased in a blue legal folder. She handed one copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge and smoothly slid another copy across the aisle directly in front of Marcus Thorne and Terrence. Your Honor, I direct your attention to the prenuptial agreement executed by both parties exactly 6 years ago, Evelyn stated, her voice ringing clear and sharp like a warning bell. Terrence's face instantly dropped. The arrogant smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated panic. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at the blue folder sitting in front of him as if it were a venomous snake. 6 years ago, when Terrence had first been promoted to a junior bank manager, his ego had inflated to the size of a blimp. He suddenly believed he was Atlanta's most eligible elite bachelor. His mother, Dolores, had whispered toxic lies into his ear, convincing him that I was a gold digger plotting to steal his newly acquired suburban wealth. He was so terrified that I would take his modest bank salary that he had forced me to sign a draconian, merciless prenuptial agreement before our wedding. It was a completely one-sided document designed to protect his assets at all costs. But Terrence, in his overwhelming arrogance, had demanded one very specific clause. He had explicitly demanded a clause stating that any business venture, corporate entity, or professional brand formed by either party independently would remain 100% separate property. It clearly stated that such businesses would be completely immune to any future claims of marital division, equitable distribution, or alimony, regardless of when the business was conceptualized or funded. He had created that ruthless legal clause to protect his own future entrepreneurial dreams and to keep me entirely dependent on his goodwill. He wanted to ensure that if I ever tried to start a small hobby business, it would never touch his real money. Your Honor. Evelyn continued walking slowly toward the center of the room. As you can clearly read in Section 4, Paragraph 2, Mr. Vance legally, explicitly, and permanently waived any and all rights to claim ownership over any business entity owned or operated by my client. He demanded this clause to protect himself. He cannot now ask this court to ignore a legally binding prenuptial agreement simply because his ex-wife became a millionaire and he deeply regrets his own legal drafting. Marcus Thorne aggressively flipped through the pages of the prenup, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text. You could physically see the realization hitting him. Thorne took this case on contingency, meaning he only got paid if Terrence won. Thorne suddenly realized he was not going to get a single dime. He turned his head and glared at Terrence with absolute unfiltered rage. Terrence had never mentioned the prenup to his sleazy lawyer because Terrence was so blinded by his desperate need for quick cash that he had completely forgotten his own arrogant trap. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and read the clause aloud to the silent courtroom. He looked down at Terrence with an expression of sheer absolute disgust. Mr. Vance, you signed a binding prenuptial agreement waiving your rights to these exact business assets. The judge said, his voice cold and sharp. You then bring this woman into my courtroom, waste public resources, and file frivolous emergency motions to claim assets you explicitly contracted away. This is not a court of law seeking justice. This is an extortion attempt masquerading as a civil suit. Terrence opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. No sound came out. He looked back at his mother and sister in the gallery. Dolores had her hand clamped over her mouth in sheer horror. Tasha looked like she was going to be physically sick. The magical millions they had been planning to steal had just vanished into thin air. I am dismissing this case with prejudice, Judge Harrison declared, slamming his gavel down with a resounding crack. You are permanently barred from bringing these ridiculous claims before this court ever again. Furthermore, I am granting the respondent's countermotion in full. Mr. Vance, you are hereby ordered to pay 100% of your ex-wife's legal fees and travel expenses for forcing her to defend against this malicious and baseless lawsuit. You have 30 days to produce the funds or you will be held in contempt of court. The courtroom was completely dead silent. Terrence was utterly destroyed. His own arrogant weapon, the very document he had used to try and make me feel small and powerless years ago, was now the exact ironclad shield protecting my $15 million staging empire. He had tried to rob me to pay for Brianna's luxury lifestyle, and instead he had just added tens of thousands of dollars in premium legal fees to his already suffocating mountain of debt. I stood up slowly, buttoning my charcoal blazer with absolute perfect composure. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not even look at Terrence as I gathered my purse. I simply turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with Evelyn right beside me. As I passed Dolores and Tasha, I could hear their rapid, panicked breathing. They were entirely trapped in the nightmare of their own greed. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. The sun was shining brightly, and the dark, suffocating chapter of my life with the Vance family was finally completely over. I pulled out my phone and booked a first-class ticket back to Chicago. My new empire was waiting, and I did not have another second to waste on men who build their kingdoms on shifting sand. Even as the sleek black town car pulled away from the Fulton County Courthouse, leaving Terrence and his toxic family standing on the pavement, a lingering shadow of unease crept down my spine. The legal victory was absolute, but I knew Terrence Vance better than anyone. He was a cornered animal completely stripped of his arrogant pride and staring directly down the barrel of severe financial ruin. Desperate men rarely surrender gracefully. They lash out with unpredictable malice. My primary concern was no longer my business or my wealth, it was Aaliyah. Terrence was fully aware that our daughter was my only vulnerability. I could not board my first-class flight back to Chicago with even a fraction of a doubt regarding her absolute safety. I needed an ironclad guarantee that Terrence was not plotting a malicious retaliation or hiring underground thugs to track our movements across state lines. I instructed my driver to bypass the airport and head straight toward a highly discreet glass building in the affluent Buckhead district. I was not looking for a standard private detective who chased cheating spouses and took blurry photographs from parked cars. I needed an absolute ghost. My Chicago legal team had highly recommended a man named Silas Monroe, a former federal intelligence operative who now ran a premier private security and surveillance firm for high-net-worth clients. Silas did not advertise his services, and he certainly did not come cheap. I walked into his sterile minimalist office and sat across from him, sliding a massive cashier's check across the polished steel desk as a retainer. I gave him a single strict directive. He was to watch Terrence Vance around the clock. I wanted a complete digital and physical perimeter placed around my ex-husband. I needed to know if he booked any flights, hired any private investigators, or made any sudden moves toward Chicago. The following week in Illinois felt like a victory lap. I threw myself into my work with renewed focus and relentless energy. The Sterling Penthouse project had catapulted my firm into the highest echelons of the city's real estate market. I was taking meetings with developers, signing lucrative contracts, and rapidly expanding my team. My days were filled with selecting premium textiles, sourcing authentic artwork, and transforming empty spaces into breathtaking luxury homes. I had completely reclaimed my power and my life. Every evening, I returned to my own beautiful home, where Aaliyah was thriving in her new environment, entirely insulated from the toxic chaos of the Vance family. But my quiet peace was abruptly interrupted on a rainy Tuesday evening when a highly encrypted notification suddenly flashed across my secure laptop screen. I was sitting alone in my expansive corner office, the glittering Chicago skyline slightly obscured by heavy gray storm clouds. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting the floor-to-ceiling windows provided a calming backdrop as I set down my espresso and opened the secure portal. I was expecting a highly routine summary from Silas Monroe. I anticipated a brief report detailing Terrence's pathetic attempts to dodge his aggressive creditors, or perhaps surveillance footage of Dolores throwing a temper tantrum at her local country club because her credit cards were finally declining. I authenticated the decryption key and downloaded the massive file, expecting nothing more than confirmation of their continuing downward spiral. Silas had attached a single cryptic message to the top of the digital dossier: Client, update protocol. Target status. Terrence Vance is completely clean regarding any physical or digital tracking of your location. He lacks the financial resources to mount any offensive strategy and has made zero inquiries regarding your daughter. Button. Secondary subject. My team maintained the surveillance perimeter around his immediate associates as a standard precaution and began actively tracking his pregnant girlfriend, Brianna. Critical alert. You need to review this immediately. Terrence is not the predator in this scenario. He is the prey. I leaned forward in my plush leather chair, my heart suddenly pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs as I opened the attached documents. The file was incredibly dense, filled with high-resolution surveillance photographs, complex financial flowcharts, and heavily redacted corporate registry filings. Silas and his team had meticulously documented Brianna's daily routine over the past 7 days. The photographs showed her strutting through high-end Atlanta boutiques carrying the exact $20,000 Birkin bag she had proudly extorted from Terrence. She was captured sipping expensive mocktails at luxury cafes, getting premium spa treatments, and lounging by the rooftop pool of her elite downtown building. She looked like a woman without a single care in the world, completely insulated from the financial apocalypse currently destroying the man she claimed to love. But it was the financial data Silas had expertly unearthed that made my breath catch in my throat. When Terrence had proudly paraded his infidelity, he had aggressively boasted about securing an ultra-exclusive penthouse for his new pregnant mistress. He had used it as a psychological weapon to make me feel inadequate, claiming he was finally providing a lavish lifestyle for a woman who truly appreciated his dominance. I had assumed, knowing his desperate financial state, that he was drowning himself in high-interest predatory loans just to cover the astronomical monthly rent. It was exactly the kind of pathetic, ego-driven financial suicide Terrence was known for. He would gladly bankrupt himself just to maintain the illusion of being a powerful provider. Silas's meticulous investigation revealed a completely different and far more sinister reality. I scrolled through the attached lease agreements and corporate tax records Silas had legally procured through his extensive intelligence network. The luxury penthouse apartment Brianna was currently occupying was completely outside of Terrence's financial orbit. The lease was not signed by Terrence Vance. His name appeared absolutely nowhere on the rental agreement, the building registry, the parking garage manifest, or the utility accounts. Furthermore, the lease was not signed by Brianna either. The $15,000 monthly rent was being paid in full, automatically on the first of every single month via a direct international wire transfer. I traced Silas's highlighted red arrows connecting the wire transfers to their original source. The money was originating from an anonymous corporate account belonging to a mysterious shell company registered as Obsidian Holdings, LLC. I sat back, my mind racing as I read through the corporate structuring Silas had uncovered. Obsidian Holdings LLC was a total ghost entity. It was registered in Delaware to completely obscure the true ownership, utilizing a highly secretive registered agent service that provided zero personal names on the public record. The corporate accounts were heavily insulated, funded by untraceable digital transfers that expertly masked the original source of the massive wealth. Silas noted in his detailed summary that Brianna had exclusive access to a corporate black card issued by this exact same LLC. The luxury baby clothes, the imported Italian nursery furniture, the daily premium spa treatments, none of it was actually being funded by Terrence's desperate credit cards. Brianna was mercilessly bleeding Terrence dry for the sheer sport of it, demanding cash and expensive gifts to test his absolute compliance. She was forcing him into extreme debt just to prove his loyalty, while she secretly lived off a massive hidden fortune provided by a completely faceless benefactor. A cold, dark realization washed over me as the puzzle pieces slammed together with terrifying clarity. Terrence thought he was the ultimate alpha male, dominating his new relationship and securing a beautiful young mistress. He genuinely believed he was the sole provider, the powerful bank manager rescuing a younger woman and showering her with a luxury lifestyle. In reality, he was nothing but a highly convenient, incredibly gullible mark. Brianna was not a dependent, submissive mistress waiting around for him to pay her bills. She was a highly calculated operative running a massive long con. She was actively using Terrence's monumental ego and his desperate need for validation to mask her true financial situation. Terrence was completely broke, scrambling for pennies and begging his mother for loans. He absolutely did not have the capital to fund a hidden shell corporation paying $15,000 a month for a luxury high-rise. He was a disgraced former bank manager with a destroyed credit score, not an offshore financial mastermind. This meant only one thing. Someone else was paying for Brianna's lavish lifestyle. Someone incredibly wealthy, extremely dangerous, and completely hidden in the shadows. Terrence had foolishly abandoned his marriage, his daughter, and his entire financial security for a woman who was actively playing a high-stakes game he did not even know existed. He had handed me the ultimate legal victory in his desperate rush to secure a life with Brianna, while completely oblivious to the fact that Brianna belonged to someone else entirely. Her entire existence was a carefully constructed lie funded by a ghost corporation. I closed the laptop, the bright glow of the screen fading into the quiet darkness of my Chicago office. A sharp, dangerous smile slowly curved across my lips. Terrence was entirely trapped in a sticky web of his own arrogant making, and the spider waiting at the center was far more lethal than he could ever comprehend. The man who had tried to destroy me was currently being dismantled from the inside out, and he was entirely too blind to see it coming. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city I was rapidly conquering. Down in Atlanta, Terrence was probably sweating over another collection notice, entirely convinced that he was the master of his own universe. He had no idea that the luxury penthouse he visited every night was actually a gilded cage paid for by a phantom. He had no idea that the pregnant woman demanding his last remaining dollars was executing a financial scheme that made his petty bank fraud look like an absolute joke. I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water and took a slow, satisfying sip. My future was completely secure, my daughter was absolutely safe, and my business was an unstoppable juggernaut. As for Terrence Vance and his entire toxic family, they were about to collide with a reality far more brutal than any revenge I could have ever planned myself. I turned off the office lights and headed home, leaving the spectacular destruction of Terrence Vance exactly where it belonged, completely out of my hands. While Terrence was busy shouting his delusional fantasies into the sterile air of that rented Atlanta penthouse, I was sitting at my sleek glass desk in Chicago, completely unbothered and entirely focused on protecting my peace. I had not survived the toxic swamp of the Vance family just to let them drag me back into their chaotic dysfunction. Before I had even boarded my first-class flight out of Georgia following that glorious courtroom ambush, I had made one extremely vital phone call. I hired a private investigator. I knew Terrence too well to believe he would simply accept his humiliating defeat and walk away gracefully. His massive, fragile ego was completely shattered, and a cornered narcissist drowning in debt is a dangerous animal. I needed absolute concrete assurance that he was not attempting to physically track my movements or stalk Aaliyah. I paid a premium retainer to a former federal operative named Silas Monroe, instructing him to place a complete digital and physical surveillance perimeter around my ex-husband. Silas was a ghost, and he was worth every single penny of his exorbitant fee. Within a week, he had mapped out the entire pathetic reality of Terrence's daily existence. The initial encrypted reports detailed Terrence's frantic visits to payday lenders, his aggressive rejection from reputable banks, and his pathetic posturing at the country club, where his membership dues were currently 90 days past due. Silas confirmed that Terrence lacked the financial resources and the basic competence to mount any sort of offensive strategy against me. But Silas was a thorough professional, and he did not just stop at monitoring Terrence. He followed the rapid money trail bleeding out of Terrence's depleted accounts and traced it directly to Brianna. He then executed a routine background check on Brianna's lavish lifestyle, focusing specifically on the $15,000 a month downtown penthouse she currently occupied. That was when Silas hit a massive concrete wall that required specialized legal maneuvering to break through. As a luxury real estate staging CEO, I knew exactly how elite property leases operated. You do not just walk into a premium Buckhead high-rise and sign a lease with a destroyed credit score and a mountain of secret debt. The management companies require ironclad proof of income, extensive background checks, and massive liquid deposits. Terrence did not possess a single one of those things. I instructed Silas to dig deeper and find out exactly whose signature was on that lease agreement. It took him 5 days and a few very expensive favors from his contacts in the Georgia real estate registry to pierce the corporate veil protecting the property. The lease was not under Terrence's name. It was not under Brianna's name either. The penthouse was leased to a shadowy holding company called Obsidian Holdings, LLC. The exorbitant rent was being paid in full automatically on the first of every month via a direct corporate wire transfer. Terrence was handing Brianna thousands of dollars in hard cash to cover her extravagant demands and designer bags, but the actual roof over her head was being funded by an entirely different entity. Silas dug into the LLC, pulling the articles of incorporation and tracking the registered agent through a maze of Delaware tax loopholes. When I opened the final PDF report and read the name of the primary shareholder, my blood ran completely cold before a wave of absolute shocking realization washed over me. The sole managing director of Obsidian Holdings LLC was Andre. He was Tasha's husband. He was my former brother-in-law. He was the quiet, fiercely successful investment banker who always stood perfectly straight in family photos, projecting the ultimate image of an elite, devoted family man. Tasha paraded Andre around Atlanta high society like a shiny, expensive accessory, constantly bragging about his unwavering fidelity, his massive salary, and his absolute commitment to their perfect marriage. Dolores constantly held Andre up as the absolute gold standard of the Vance family legacy, completely ignoring the fact that he had merely married into their chaotic bloodline. I sat back in my plush leather office chair, letting the sheer magnitude of this discovery settle into my brain. The implications were staggering and deeply sinister. Andre was paying for Brianna's luxury apartment. He had established a shell company specifically to hide the massive financial trail from his aggressively status-obsessed wife, Tasha. Terrence, the grand alpha male who believed he was running the entire show, was nothing more than a convenient, useful idiot. He was running himself into complete financial ruin, desperately scraping together extortion money to keep Brianna happy, while another man was quietly funding the major infrastructure of her life. I immediately called Silas and authorized an unlimited expansion of his budget. I told him to completely drop Terrence from the primary surveillance detail. Terrence was a sinking ship, and he no longer mattered. I wanted every available camera, every long-range lens, and every digital tracker locked entirely onto Andre and Brianna. I needed indisputable, undeniable proof of what my instincts were screaming at me. Silas agreed without hesitation, sensing the massive shift in the dynamic. Exactly 7 days later, a second highly encrypted file arrived in my secure inbox. I closed my office door, locked it, and opened the attachment. The first photograph was a high-definition night vision shot of Andre's distinct black Mercedes pulling into the private underground parking garage of Brianna's downtown high-rise. The timestamp was printed clearly in the corner, reading, Tuesday at 11:45 at night. That was the exact time Tasha was usually posting her late-night skincare routines on social media, bragging to her followers about her peaceful, secure suburban life. The next series of photographs were even more damning. They were taken in broad daylight on a sunny Thursday afternoon. Silas had tracked Brianna to an ultra-exclusive private prenatal clinic located in the wealthiest section of Buckhead. It was the kind of discreet, high-end medical facility that catered to celebrities and politicians, featuring private rear entrances and strict non-disclosure agreements. Silas had positioned himself perfectly in a rented vehicle across the street. The sequence of photos showed Brianna walking out of the clinic's private rear exit, wearing oversized sunglasses and a flowing designer dress. A second later, a man stepped out directly behind her. It was Andre. He placed a highly protective, familiar hand on the small of her back, guiding her smoothly toward his waiting luxury SUV. In one incredibly sharp image, Andre reached out and gently, affectionately touched Brianna's growing stomach. The intimacy of the gesture was undeniable. It was not the touch of a friendly benefactor or a casual acquaintance helping out a family friend. It was the proud, possessive touch of an expectant father. The baby Brianna was carrying, the child Terrence was destroying his entire life and reputation to provide for, did not belong to Terrence. It belonged to Andre. My ex-husband was actively bankrupting himself, taking out loans from dangerous underground predators and risking severe legal retaliation, all to fund a nursery for his own sister's husband. The sheer magnificent cruelty of the deception was almost beautiful in its dark symmetry. Terrence had discarded me out of pure ego and lust, declaring that Brianna provided him with the respect and submission he deserved as a man. Yet he was currently playing the role of a pathetic, ignorant shield. Brianna had expertly manipulated his massive ego, convincing him the child was his, so he would shower her with cash and gifts, while her actual wealthy lover secured her real estate and attended her private medical appointments right under everyone's noses. I printed the photographs, laying them out in a neat, pristine row across the smooth glass surface of my desk. I stared at the glossy images of Andre and Brianna, examining the absolute destruction of the Vance family legacy resting right beneath my fingertips. Dolores Vance had spent her entire adult life brutally enforcing an image of flawless, upper-crust superiority. She had viciously criticized me for lacking pedigree and celebrated Tasha's marriage as the absolute pinnacle of elite success. Tasha had built her entire fragile identity around being the perfect society wife, looking down her nose at anyone who did not meet her impossibly high standards. And Terrence was the arrogant golden boy who genuinely believed he was untouchable. This single stack of photographs held the absolute power to detonate all of them simultaneously. If I mailed these images to Tasha, her perfect, pristine marriage would instantly violently implode. She would be utterly humiliated in front of the entire Buckhead social circle she worshipped. If I sent them to Dolores, the shock of her perfect son-in-law, fathering a child with her son's scandalous mistress, would likely induce a genuine medical emergency. And if I showed them to Terrence, his fragile, inflated ego would completely shatter into a million pieces. He would realize he was nothing more than a heavily indebted pawn playing the absolute fool in his own family's dark comedy. I gathered the photographs, tapping the edges together, until they formed a perfectly neat stack. I slid them into a thick manila folder and locked them securely inside my office safe. I was not going to release them. Not yet. The true power of a nuclear weapon lies entirely in the threat of its detonation. Dropping the bomb right now would certainly be satisfying, but it lacked strategic elegance. I was going to let Terrence continue to drown in his own arrogant delusions. I was going to let Tasha continue to brag loudly about her flawless husband. I was going to let Dolores continue to preach to her church friends about her family's pristine reputation. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the massive hole tearing through the hull. I possessed the absolute truth, and that truth was the ultimate armor. If Terrence Dolores or Tasha ever dared to look in my direction again, I had the exact ammunition required to burn their entire kingdom to ash. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent architecture of Chicago. The city pulsed with energy and infinite possibility. I took a deep, calming breath, feeling an immense, radiant sense of peace wash over my entire body. I was no longer playing defense against the Vance family. I held all the cards. I controlled the entire board. And I was going to enjoy every single second of watching them blindly architect their own spectacular demise. 3 weeks later, Dolores Vance provided a stage so magnificently arrogant that I simply could not resist returning to Atlanta to watch the fire burn in person. The invitation arrived through the affluent Southern social grapevine like a toxic piece of gossip wrapped in holy scripture. Dolores was the newly appointed head of the planning committee for the 40th anniversary gala of the First Cathedral of Greater Atlanta. This was not a modest church basement potluck with lukewarm casseroles and folding chairs. This was an ultra-exclusive high society religious event designed to separate the wealthy elite congregations from the common members. But Dolores, being the ultimate narcissist, had completely hijacked the sacred celebration to serve her own massive ego. She was transforming the entire second half of the anniversary banquet into a lavish public baby shower for Brianna. She wanted to parade her pregnant future daughter-in-law in front of the entire congregation to prove to her judgmental church friends that her son Terrence was a wealthy, thriving patriarch. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of turning a holy function into a spectacle of fake wealth was classic Dolores. The schedule of events for the evening was a masterclass in absolute delusion. Tasha was scheduled as the keynote speaker for the women's ministry segment of the evening. Her chosen topic was building a solid foundation of Christian marriage and unwavering fidelity. She was going to stand at a grand podium in her expensive designer clothes and preach to hundreds of devout women about her flawless union with Andre. She was preparing to hold up her quiet, perfect family man husband as the ultimate prize, entirely blind to the fact that he was currently funding a luxury penthouse for her brother's mistress and fathering the very child Dolores was throwing a shower for. Terrence was slated to give a speech immediately following his sister focusing on financial stewardship and stepping into the divine role of a modern provider. He was going to stand in front of God and his entire community, pretending he was independently funding Brianna's lavish lifestyle while secretly drowning in massive high-interest debt just to keep up appearances. The interlocking layers of absolute hypocrisy were staggering. I knew I had to be in that room. I needed a front-row seat to the greatest theatrical farce in Atlanta history, but I could not simply buy a ticket and walk through the front doors. Dolores controlled the guest list with an iron fist, meticulously screening every single attendee to ensure her perfect image remained untarnished. I needed a completely untouchable backdoor into the event. I looked at the glossy digital flyer for the gala and noticed the committee was desperately seeking corporate sponsors to underwrite the massive costs of the event. Dolores wanted champagne luxury on a sparkling cider budget, and she was begging local businesses to foot the bill. I picked up my phone and called my chief operating officer in Chicago. My firm had recently acquired a boutique luxury event staging company in Atlanta as a subsidiary to expand our corporate footprint in the southern real estate market. I instructed my team to reach out to the First Cathedral Gala Committee immediately. My subsidiary firm, operating under a completely different corporate name, offered to step in as the anonymous platinum sponsor for the entire anniversary event. We offered to completely underwrite the staging, the floral design, the ambient lighting, and the luxury table settings. We essentially handed them $250,000 worth of premier event production absolutely free of charge. Dolores jumped at the bait like a starving wolf. She eagerly accepted the anonymous corporate sponsorship, completely blinded by her greedy desire for a free luxury upgrade that would make her look like a miracle worker to her pastor. She happily signed the strict vendor agreements, giving my company absolute creative control over the aesthetic environment of her grandest moment. In exchange for this massive charitable donation, my anonymous corporation was granted an exclusive private VIP table directly in the front row of the banquet hall. I flew my top creative directors down to Atlanta with a very specific and demanding vision. I wanted the church banquet hall transformed into a breathtaking display of overwhelming sensory opulence. We brought in thousands of imported white orchids, constructing massive cascading floral arches over the main entrance and the central stage. We draped the ugly standard banquet hall walls in sheer imported ivory silk, illuminated by soft golden uplighting that made the entire room glow from within. We brought in custom crystal centerpieces, mirrored tables, and heavy velvet draped chairs. I wanted Dolores to look around and feel absolutely intoxicated by the sheer immense wealth of the room. I wanted her to feel like a victorious queen right before I pulled the entire throne out from under her. On the evening of the gala, I flew into Atlanta on a private charter, ensuring my arrival was completely off the radar of anyone connected to the Vance family. I wore a striking midnight blue evening gown, tailored to absolute perfection with a subtle dramatic split and sharp structured shoulders that projected pure unfiltered authority. I paired it with a vintage diamond collar necklace and stiletto heels that echoed like a gavel striking wood with every single deliberate step. I arrived at the church banquet hall an hour after the doors officially opened, intentionally bypassing the crowded red carpet arrivals and slipping silently through the private vendor entrance my security team had secured in advance. Inside the hall, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy, sweet scent of fresh orchids filled the air, masking the usual smell of church-polished wood and old carpet. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a highly sophisticated backdrop to the excited chatter of the congregation. The church members were dressed in their Sunday best, whispering in sheer absolute awe at the incredible anonymous sponsorship that had elevated their church anniversary into the absolute social event of the season. I took my seat at the shadowed VIP table situated slightly off to the right side of the main stage. The lighting had been specifically designed by my staging team to keep this particular table shrouded in a soft, ambient dimness, making it virtually impossible for the people standing under the bright stage lights to clearly see who was sitting there. I sat back gracefully, sipping my sparkling water, and watched the circus finally begin. Dolores took the stage first. She was wearing an oversized metallic gold suit that caught the stage lights and made her look like a giant wrapped candy. She wore a church hat so massive and heavily embellished it practically required its own zip code. She gripped the microphone with both hands and began preaching loudly about her family's incredible divine blessings. She went on for 10 excruciating minutes about the Lord favoring the Vance family, bragging shamelessly about Terrence's fictional financial success, and Tasha's highly enviable perfect marriage. She then dramatically called Brianna to the stage. Brianna walked up the stairs wearing a tight white maternity dress dripping in expensive diamond tennis bracelets that Andre had quietly purchased for her using his untraceable shell company accounts. Dolores proudly presented Brianna to the congregation, declaring her a beautiful, faithful addition to their wealthy, thriving family. The congregation clapped politely, completely unaware of the absolute filth standing before them. Terrence strutted up next, puffing out his chest like a proud, arrogant peacock. He wrapped his arm tightly around Brianna's waist, posing for the flashing cameras of the church photographers. He grabbed the microphone from his mother and gave a sickeningly arrogant speech about the deep importance of being a strong male provider. He looked out at the crowd of hundreds lying effortlessly through his teeth about his massive financial prowess and his unwavering devotion to his new growing family. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that he was standing next to a woman carrying another man's child. He was completely unaware that he was standing in a room entirely funded and designed by his discarded ex-wife. Then came Tasha. She glided to the podium looking exceptionally smug in a fitted crimson dress. Andre sat in the front row, directly in the center, watching her with an expression of mild, polite interest, playing the role of the devoted husband with terrifying perfection. Tasha launched into a deeply hypocritical, passionate sermon about marital loyalty, respect, and keeping the devil out of your sacred home. She pointed directly to Andre, praising him as her solid rock, her faithful king, and the absolute standard for all Christian men to follow. Andre smiled humbly at the applause, waving slightly to the crowd, entirely unfazed by the fact that his pregnant secret mistress was sitting just a few feet away, pretending to be his brother-in-law's ultimate prize. The sheer volume of the deception in that room was intoxicating. They were all suffocating in a toxic, dense cloud of their own manufactured lies. Dolores was bragging about generational wealth that absolutely did not exist. Terrence was publicly claiming a child that was biologically not his. Tasha was preaching loudly about a faithful marriage that was a complete, devastating sham. And Brianna was playing the innocent, glowing mother-to-be while secretly sleeping with her boyfriend's wealthy, powerful brother-in-law. I sat in the quiet shadows of my exclusive VIP table, watching them gorge themselves on the beautiful luxury I had meticulously provided. They were eating prime filet from my crystal plates, sitting comfortably on my velvet chairs, and breathing in the expensive scent of my imported orchids. They felt entirely invincible. They felt totally untouchable in their holy sanctuary. But they were merely amateur actors performing on a beautifully staged set that I completely owned and controlled. I had the explosive surveillance photographs secured in a sleek black leather portfolio resting quietly on my lap. I was not going to interrupt their ridiculous speeches. I was going to let them reach the absolute highest peak of their arrogant joy before I made my presence known. I was going to let them finish painting their flawless masterpiece of lies right before I took a massive, heavy sledgehammer to the canvas. As the final echoing applause rolled through the massive sanctuary, Tasha stepped down from the podium with a sickeningly triumphant smile plastered across her face. The formal program had finally concluded, and the church's revered Pastor Williams stepped up to the microphone, his booming voice officially blessing the food and inviting the congregation to mingle and enjoy the extravagant banquet. This was my cue. The house lights shifted from the dramatic stage spotlights to a warm ambient glow illuminating the hundreds of guests who immediately began moving toward the opulent buffet stations and the crystal-draped bars. I stood up slowly from my secluded VIP table in the shadowed alcove. I smoothed the invisible lines of my midnight blue silk gown and stepped directly into the light. I did not rush. I walked with the slow measured cadence of a woman who completely owned the ground beneath her feet. The vintage diamonds at my throat caught the ambient lighting, throwing fractured prisms of blinding white light across the walls. My stiletto heels tapped a sharp rhythmic beat against the polished marble floors. It took exactly 15 seconds for the first person to recognize me. An older woman in a lavish pink suit gasped, spilling a drop of her sparkling cider. She urgently tapped the shoulder of the woman next to her and pointed in my direction. The whispers started instantly. They rippled through the grand banquet hall like a sudden gust of wind rushing through dry autumn leaves. Heads turned. Conversations abruptly halted. Forks were lowered. The congregation parted before me like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path directly toward the center of the room. Dolores Terrence. Tasha and Brianna were holding court near the lavishly decorated head table, completely surrounded by fawning church members who were busy congratulating them on their beautiful family and their impending new arrival. Andre was standing slightly off to the side, holding a glass of water, looking completely bored with the entire spectacle. I watched Dolores's oversized gold church hat bob wildly as she laughed at a joke. Then a deacon leaned in and whispered urgently into her ear. Dolores turned her head, her eyes locked onto mine and her jaw practically unhinged. She violently tapped Terrence on the arm. He turned around, his arrogant smirk freezing entirely on his face. For a fraction of a second, I saw sheer panic flash through his eyes before his massive delusional ego rushed in to protect him. He instantly puffed out his chest, adjusting his leased suit jacket. Tasha followed his gaze, and her face twisted into a mask of absolute pure disgust. They did not wait for me to reach them. The three of them detached themselves from their group of admirers and marched aggressively toward my VIP section, acting like a pack of rabid guard dogs protecting their territory. Dolores reached me first, her face flushed dark purple beneath her heavy makeup. "How dare you show your face in this sanctuary?" She hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper, designed to avoid alerting the nearby guests. "How did you even get past the security desk? You are not a member of this congregation, Keisha, and you are certainly not welcome at my family's celebration." Terrence stepped in front of his mother, crossing his arms over his chest, looking down at me with an expression of supreme, arrogant pity. "I honestly cannot believe this, Keisha," he sneered, shaking his head slowly. "I knew you were struggling with the divorce, but flying all the way down to Atlanta just to stalk me at a church gala. It is genuinely pathetic. You just could not handle seeing me upgrade to a real woman, could you? You had to come down here and try to ruin my moment because you are so incredibly bitter that I moved on and created the family you could never give me." He actually believed it. He fully, genuinely believed that I was a heartbroken, discarded wife who had flown hundreds of miles just to beg for his attention. Tasha immediately flanked him, glaring at me with unfiltered hostility. "This is an exclusive, classy event, Keisha," she snapped, her tone dripping with intense elitist condescension. "This is absolutely not the place for bitter ex-wives to come begging for scraps. Terrence is a wealthy, respected man now, and he is building a legacy with Brianna. You are nothing but a dark, embarrassing chapter of his past. You need to turn around and walk out those doors right now before I personally have the church deacons physically throw you out onto the street." I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single defensive word. I simply looked at the three of them, allowing a slow, chilling smile to touch the corners of my mouth. They were so predictable. They were so utterly trapped in their own shallow, pathetic vanity that they could not even recognize the absolute danger standing right in front of them. My silence seemed to infuriate Dolores even more. Her chest heaved rapidly under her gold suit, and she opened her mouth to launch another vicious verbal assault. But before she could speak, a booming, cheerful voice interrupted the tense standoff. "Sister Dolores, is everything all right over here?" Pastor Williams approached our small circle, his warm, pastoral smile firmly in place. He was a tall, imposing man who commanded immense respect, and he had noticed the tense huddle near the VIP section. He looked at me, his eyes widening slightly in appreciation of my elegant attire, before turning a questioning gaze to Dolores. I smoothly bypassed Dolores and extended my hand directly to the pastor, completely taking control of the interaction. "Good evening, Pastor Williams," I said, my voice radiating absolute warmth and refined professionalism. "I am Keisha Vance, CEO of Sterling Staging and Design out of Chicago. I must commend you on a truly magnificent anniversary gala. Your church home is absolutely breathtaking, and the spirit in this room is wonderfully vibrant." The pastor took my hand, his smile widening into genuine delight. "Well, bless you, Sister Keisha," he boomed happily. "We are so honored to have visitors from Chicago joining our celebration. Are you a friend of the Vance family?" Dolores looked like she was actively choking on a lemon. She grabbed the pastor's forearm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Pastor, this woman is Terrence's ex-wife," Dolores interrupted frantically, her voice rising in panic. "She is a highly disturbed individual who crashed this private event to harass my son and his new pregnant girlfriend. She is completely uninvited, and I need you to have security remove her from these premises immediately." The pastor looked incredibly confused, taking a startled step back and looking between Dolores and me with deep concern. He opened his mouth to call for the head usher, but I raised a single perfectly manicured hand, stopping him completely in his tracks. I did not stop smiling. I turned my gaze slowly from the pastor and locked eyes directly with Dolores. "Remove me," I asked, my tone light, conversational and dripping with absolute lethal ice. "Dolores, you clearly have not been paying attention to the gala committee contracts you signed last month." Terrence frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about, Keisha?" he demanded aggressively. "You have absolutely no business being in this building." I completely ignored him, keeping my eyes deadlocked on his mother. "I noticed you were struggling to find the necessary funding to cover this lavish little party, Dolores," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. "You wanted crystal plates, imported silk drapery, and thousands of white orchids, but your committee budget could barely afford paper napkins and folding chairs, so you went begging for a corporate sponsor." Dolores's eyes darted frantically around the room, suddenly realizing the corporate name I had just used to introduce myself to the pastor. The blood began to drain rapidly from her face, leaving her looking gray and sickly under the bright chandeliers. Tasha crossed her arms, looking wildly between me and her mother. "What is she talking about, Mom?" Tasha demanded. "I am the anonymous platinum sponsor," I stated clearly, letting the words hit them like physical blows. "My Chicago firm completely underwrote this entire evening. I paid for the velvet chairs you are sitting on. I paid for the gourmet filet you are about to eat. I paid for the imported silk covering these walls and every single orchid in this room. This entire breathtaking luxury experience you have been using to brag to your church friends was completely funded by my bank accounts." Terrence physically staggered backward as if he had been shoved. His mouth fell open, exposing his absolute shock. He looked around the massive, beautifully decorated hall, suddenly realizing that the very environment he had just used to boast about his wealth was actually a monument to my supreme financial dominance. Tasha looked like she was going to be physically sick. Dolores stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her humiliation. She had invited hundreds of people to celebrate her family's status, completely unaware she was dancing on a stage I had purchased with my spare change. But I was not finished. I turned back to Pastor Williams, who was watching the exchange in stunned, absolute silence. As the platinum sponsor pastor, I believe my contract strictly guaranteed me a few minutes of stage time to address the congregation and present a special gift to the community, I said smoothly. The pastor nodded numbly, unable to contradict the financial benefactor of his church's greatest event. "Yes, of course, Sister Keisha," he stammered. "The stage is yours whenever you are ready." I turned my gaze back to the terrified Vance family. My smile was completely gone, replaced by a look of cold, calculating execution. "Do not worry, Terrence," I whispered, my voice dropping to a lethal silken threat. "I am not here to cause a mindless scene. I am simply here to claim my reserved stage time." I have prepared a very special, incredibly detailed tribute video for you and your beautiful expectant bride. I think the entire congregation is going to be absolutely fascinated by the story it tells. I turned on my stiletto heel, leaving them suffocating in their own terror, and began my slow, deliberate walk directly toward the center stage. I did not stick around to watch the inevitable messy arrival of the police. The distant, frantic wail of sirens was already beginning to cut through the humid southern air, echoing down the street like a tragic fitting soundtrack to the Vance family's spectacular demise. Right before I had slipped through that exit, I had deliberately set my untouched glass of sparkling cider down on a polished mahogany table near the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. It was a silent, gleaming testament to my absolute sobriety in the face of their intoxicating chaos. I left it there, catching the ambient light, a final lingering ghost of my presence. Now walking down the sweeping stone steps of the exterior courtyard, I maintained a steady, rhythmic pace, feeling the cool night breeze wash over my skin. The night felt incredibly crisp and clean. The heavy, oppressive weight of my past was finally and permanently lifted from my shoulders. My private driver was waiting precisely where I had instructed, idling quietly, in a sleek black town car, at the dark edge of the manicured church grounds. He stepped out immediately, opening the rear door with a respectful, professional nod. I slid into the plush leather interior, the faint, comforting scent of luxury leather grounding me instantly in my new reality. As the car pulled away from the curb, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 Atlanta police cruisers sped past us in the opposite direction, hurtling toward the church to clean up the violent wreckage I had masterfully orchestrated. I did not look back. I had absolutely no desire to see the ashes. Instead, I reached into my designer clutch, pulled out my phone, and initiated a FaceTime call. The screen connected almost instantly. Aaliyah's bright, beautiful face filled the display. She was safely tucked away in her spacious bedroom inside our Chicago penthouse, completely shielded from the toxic fallout occurring hundreds of miles away. She had her sketchbook propped up against her knees, humming a soft, happy tune, as she expertly shaded a vibrant drawing of the city skyline. The sheer innocence in her eyes, the absolute peace in her secure environment was the greatest victory of all. I smiled, feeling a profound, overwhelming warmth swell in my chest. We chatted about her art project, her upcoming school week, and our exciting plans for the weekend. She showed me her drawing, proudly explaining her color choices with pure, joyful enthusiasm. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that her mother had just successfully dismantled a deeply abusive dynasty, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. I had absorbed the fire and redirected the flames so she could live her entire life in the light. The fallout from the first cathedral gala was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. You cannot unring a bell of that massive magnitude, especially in a tight-knit community that thrives on gossip and public perception. The scandal rippled through the elite circles of Atlanta with terrifying speed, leaving absolutely nothing but scorched earth in its wake. Terrence, the arrogant golden boy who thought he could manipulate his way into a life of effortless luxury, finally hit his concrete wall. The revelation of his public cuckolding shattered his fragile, inflated ego beyond any hope of repair. Without the secret financial backing of his brother-in-law, his mountain of predatory debt swallowed him whole. Within 2 short months of the gala, Terrence was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. His luxury leased cars were swiftly repossessed, his country club memberships were violently revoked, and he was reduced to living in a cramped, dingy studio apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city, desperately dodging daily collection calls. Brianna predictably vanished into thin air the exact moment the cash flow dried up, taking her designer bags and her unborn child far away from the smoking crater of Terrence's ruined life. He was left with nothing but his shame. Tasha fared no better in the aftermath. The woman who had built her entire fragile identity on the grand illusion of a flawless society, marriage was suddenly the laughingstock of Buckhead. Her incredibly messy, highly public divorce from Andre became premium fodder for the local tabloids and society blogs. Andre fought back viciously in court, freezing their joint assets and exposing even more of their deep financial deceptions. Tasha was forced to quickly sell her beloved suburban estate and downsize significantly. She lost her elevated status, her wealthy husband, and her entire social circle in one single devastating blow. She tried desperately to maintain her haughty demeanor on social media, but the elite women she had spent years looking down upon immediately locked her out of their country clubs and charity boards. She became an absolute pariah, drowning alone in the very harsh judgment she used to inflict on others. And Dolores, the grand matriarch, suffered the most agonizing defeat of all. The stress and profound public humiliation of the gala incident broke her iron grip on her religious community. She could no longer parade proudly through the church aisles in her extravagant gold suits, demanding instant respect and admiration. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. The judgmental stares of the congregation she had once ruled proved far too heavy for her massive ego to bear. In a move of utter disgrace, Dolores was forced to officially step down from the church planning committee, the women's ministry, and every other leadership position she held. She retreated into a bitter, lonely isolation, sitting in her silent, quiet house, surrounded by the shattered, unfixable fragments of her once perfect family legacy. Her phone stopped ringing and her calendar remained entirely empty. I watched none of this happen in person. I read the final comprehensive reports from Silas Monroe completely detached and entirely devoid of sympathy. I was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corporate corner office, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent skyline of Chicago. My luxury staging and design firm was successfully acquiring 2 new subsidiaries. My personal wealth was compounding daily. My daughter was thriving in a home filled with genuine love and respect. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp northern air, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of the city pulse through the glass beneath my fingertips. I had walked straight into the darkest corners of the Vance family's dysfunction, and I had emerged completely unscathed. I had burned their blinding arrogance and cruel pride to ashes without ever lifting a single finger in anger. The board was cleared. The game was definitively over, and I had beautifully, absolutely won.